name's Jacqui Butler and I'm a part-time PhD candidate in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Warwick. My main interest throughout my Masters in Ancient Visual and Material Culture was in the representation of women in the ancient world, and this interest shaped my area of research for my PhD work, which is looking at a specific set of mythological female characters in Roman art and how their depiction can inform us about cultural ideals in Roman society. I also have a more general interest in Roman Britain and specifically about what can be learned about women's lives in the province. So today I'm going to discuss a case study which is a really useful example of cultural interaction in the Roman Empire from the archaeological and epigraphic record of Roman Britain. And it also gives an insight into the life of a woman named Diodora. But first of all, I want to provide some context about religion in Roman Britain. Certainly the Romans imposed a lot of their culture onto the provinces they conquered, and this was via the various forms of infrastructure that they introduced, such as the building of fortresses, cities, and roads which connected these. And these were all very visible on the physical landscape. But as well as that, they introduced their own coinage, laws, taxes, and indeed Latin, which became the official language. However, in terms of religion, this is one area where there was a bit less imposition and more amalgamation and exchange of ideas through interaction between diverse groups of people. It's important to remember that when Britain first became a Roman province in 43 AD, obviously the people living in Britain had their own deities, religious beliefs and customs. But what we see from then until the end of the Romans' occupation of Britain around 411 AD is that the people of Roman Britain lived in quite a complex religious landscape, where classical Roman deities were obviously worshipped alongside the imperial cult, but so too were the local deities, and others were brought in from other places in the empire. And this is because the Romans were actually fairly tolerant of people's spiritual beliefs, and Roman religion itself was actually fairly fluid. So instead of simply imposing Roman gods, they looked for similarities between provincial and Roman deities and assimilated them together. And a good example of this in Britain comes from Bath, where the native goddess Sulis was worshipped, and she was assimilated with Roman Minerva. And this resulted in her later being renamed as Sulis Minerva. And another important point to note is that the Roman army was made up of auxiliary units, and these were recruited from provinces throughout the empire, so from a wide geographic area. And they brought their own deities with them, meaning that Roman Britain was, in certain places, extremely multicultural. And there's plenty of evidence for this from the many inscriptions in Britain. And these attest to both people and deities from Greece, Germany, Tunisia and Palmyra, to name a few. And it's one of these that I'm going to talk about today. So this is the Sandstone Altar, which was dedicated by a woman named Diodora in the 3rd century AD. It was found in a churchyard at Corbridge on Hadrian's Wall in 1702, and it was later donated by the Duke of Northumberland to the British Museum in 1744, where it can be seen today in Gallery 49. On the front of it, it has an inscription in Greek. On the right side, it has an image of a wreath, and on the left side, a knife and bucranium. Now these are decorative motifs and they refer to animal sacrifice, which of course was a central tenet of Greco-Roman religion. The altar does have some damage to it, and it has also had the top of the capital hollowed out, suggesting that it had been later reused as a stoop to hold holy water. There's also a metal pin or fitting on the top, which suggests it had a lid at some point as well. It's also considered to be one of a pair, as there's a very similar altar which was found nearby with a similar Greek inscription and iconography. And it's worth pointing out here that there are a large number of surviving freestanding votive altars from the time period of Roman occupation. And indeed, these actually dominate the inscribed monuments that we have for Roman Britain. It's important also to understand the role that these altars played for people, as they functioned as an important means of communicating with the gods. And also, although they were quite often more symbolic rather than fully functional, they were also very much the focus of ritual. And that one was one of the key features of Roman religion, was the correct performance of specified rituals. And another thing is that it's also important to understand that Roman religion was a reciprocal arrangement, and the dedication of an altar was often part of this. So the adding of an inscription allowed for this arrangement to be publicly recorded, as well as defining the relationship between the dedicant and the deity. And they often commemorated the fulfillment of a vow. So the inscription here is translated as, "To Heracles of Tyre, Diodora, the high priestess, set this up." And the fact that it is inscribed in Greek is unusual, although it's not unique in Roman Britain. So there are two really interesting things in this inscription to explore. Firstly, the deity addressed is Heracles of Tyre. And Heracles is an example of a hero cult. And these tended to be quite localised and tied to the hero's presumed tomb. But some, such as Heracles, became pan-Hellenic and then later incorporated into the Roman pantheon. So Heracles is understood also as the Greek name for Phoenician Melkart, the patron deity of the city of Tyre. So here we have a good example of the fluidity, dynamism, and multiculturalism of religion. A Greek hero adopted into the Roman pantheon, conflated with an Eastern deity, and transported to the remote provincial garrison of Corbridge at Hadrian's Wall. And it's interesting that the inscription is also metrical. It's a hexameter. And also that the other altar it was found with that I mentioned before also has an inscription in the same meter. And this might have been an attempt to reflect erudition, and in that way also form part of identity projection. And this brings us on to the second interesting point about the inscription, as identity projection can be understood also in how Diodora identifies herself as Archaearai, which is translated as priestess or even high priestess. And this term demonstrates another element of Eastern religious culture into Roman Britain, as the term is associated with the male religious offices of the Asiarchs in Asia. Epigraphic study in Asia has shown that women served as Archaearai in their own right, and this has proved to be contrary to previous thought that the title was obtained via marriage to an Asiarch, and that they had little independent power or civic role. However, it is impossible to know what activities or rituals Diodora would have undertaken in her role as an Archaearai, or whether she acted independently or perhaps alongside others. The role of a priestess in Roman society was the only civic one women were allowed to hold, and there were many events and festivals in the religious calendar which were related to cults associated with women, such as the Bona Dea and the Matronalia. But who was Diodora? Well, unfortunately we don't have anything more to tell us than the inscription. But what we can do is infer from her dedication that it could quite easily reflect her desire for spiritual familiarity in a foreign land, and that it could represent her homeland role. She and Pulcher, who was the dedicate of the other altar, may have travelled with Eastern merchants and could have been just visiting Corbridge, or they could have settled there permanently. Regardless, identifying herself as a priestess via the inscription and the ritualistic imagery on the altar sides, the knife, bucranium and wreath, tell us that she wanted to publicly make this connection, and this may have been to elevate her status. And this, alongside the use of Greek language, suggests that Diodora had made a considered choice in identity projection, one which was intended to maintain her heritage and make a strong statement of it. And also we can be fairly certain that she must have been a woman of reasonable means in terms of being able to afford to pay for the altar and its inscription. And lastly, and quite significantly, it is one of several altars dedicated by women to deities in Roman Britain. Although the epigraphic record for women in Roman Britain is limited, these provide some evidence to show that women did dedicate altars in a similar way to men. So this brings us to the end of this case study, and I hope that it has helped to show the multicultural nature of society and religion within the province of Roman Britain, and that it can even be understood as symbolising this. And I think it also helps to show that cultural transmission into Roman Britain was not entirely Roman-centred, and that this was largely caused by human mobility throughout the Roman Empire, and this included women as well as men. And I'll just finish here by saying that if you're interested in reading about another altar dedicated by a woman in Roman Britain, check out the January 2021 entry over on the Material Musings blog titled Fortuna and a Legate's Wife, which discusses another altar which was dedicated by Sosia Younkina in the 2nd century AD. Thank you.